Everyone remembers Dexter Morgan as the killer nobody could catch. Miami trusted him. His own department signed his paychecks. 8 seasons and not one arrest. One FBI profiler sat inside that same building for months and saw something nobody else did. In this video, we break down Dexter versus the FBI. Section 1. The bodies beneath Biscayne Bay. 38 days had passed since Dexter Morgan killed his own brother, and in that time he had not been able to kill anyone else. Sergeant James Dokes had attached himself to Dexter like a shadow, sitting outside his apartment, following him to crime scenes, watching him leave the station at night. Every attempt Dexter made to get back to what he called his real work fell apart. He froze. He hesitated. He drove out to a kill and turned around. For a man whose entire life was built around a schedule of secret violence, that stretch was the closest thing to a breakdown he had ever experienced, and it left him distracted at exactly the moment he needed to be paying attention. While he was distracted, the ocean gave him up. A recreational scuba diving team went down off the coast near Bay Harbor and found something on the seabed that had nothing to do with coral or wrecks. Black plastic trash bags, weighted, torn open in places by time and current and marine life. Inside them were human remains, cut into pieces, packed neatly, sealed and dropped over the side of a boat by someone who had clearly done it many times before. The divers surfaced, called it in, and within a day, the water above that site was crowded with police boats, recovery crews, and news helicopters. The recovery operation pulled up 18 sets of remains. Every one of them had been dismembered the same way, packed the same way, weighted the same way. Whoever had done this had a method, and the method had not changed across the entire collection. Miami Metro had seen serial murder before, and the department was still raw from the ice truck killer case that had ended only a month earlier, but nothing in the department's history matched the sheer volume sitting in front of them now. This was the biggest case Miami Metro homicide had ever handled. The remains were brought ashore and laid out in a temporary field morgue, a big air-conditioned tent built specifically to hold them, while forensic teams worked through identification. Row after row of tables, each one holding what was left of a person nobody had reported missing in any urgent way. Vince Masuka was brought in to cover the bodies, and he was the one who told Dexter that the early count stood at 8 before it climbed. He was also the one who mentioned that the press had already come up with a name for whoever did this. They called him the Bay Harbor Butcher. Dexter hated the name immediately, and the show made a point of showing that reaction. He thought it was lurid, cheap, the kind of tabloid label that flattened years of careful work into a headline. That small moment of wounded professional pride told the audience everything about how he saw himself. He did not think of the underwater site as a dumping ground. He thought of it as a solution he had engineered, a system his father had helped him build, and now it was sitting under a tent with numbered tags on it, while men in windbreakers walked between the tables taking photographs. The identification process started producing results, and the results were strange. Of the bodies recovered, 13 came back with criminal records attached. Not minor records either. Assaults, homicides, cases that had been dropped, cases that had fallen apart at trial, cases where a suspect walked because of a technicality or a missing witness or a bad piece of evidence. Investigators had a pattern before they had a suspect, and the pattern pointed at something the department was not used to seeing. Someone was killing killers. That detail changed the temperature of the whole investigation. Captain Thomas Matthews looked at the case and saw a public relations problem that needed a confident face on it. And he also saw a campaign for deputy chief that could ride on a solved case. Lieutenant Esme Pascal was running the Miami Metro side of things at the start, and her time in that role would end badly. Detectives who had spent years on the street looked at the victim list and quietly worked out that they had personally arrested some of these men. Around town, the reaction went somewhere the department did not expect. Ordinary people in Miami started rooting for the killer. Not everyone, but enough of them to show up in polling, in talk radio, in casual conversation. Rita's own mother said out loud that whoever was doing this should be left alone. A comic book concept grew out of the whole thing, a masked figure called the Dark Defender who cleaned up the streets the way the courts had failed to. The city was watching a murder investigation and cheering for the wrong side, and every officer working the case had to sit with that. Dexter walked through all of it in a lab coat with a badge clipped to his belt. He was the blood spatter analyst for Miami Metro Police Department, which meant he had access to the crime scene, the evidence, the reports, and the room where the theories got argued out loud. He watched investigators he had worked beside for years stand over the pieces of men he had personally taken apart, and he offered his professional opinion when asked. The show let that irony sit without underlining it, because the visual did all the work. A man photographing his own victims for the department payroll. The forensic side of the case moved faster than Dexter would have liked. Masuka called in a marine biologist named Dr. Manny Pena to examine algae found on rocks inside the body bags. That was the kind of detail Dexter had never considered, because he had never imagined the bags coming back up. The rocks he used as weights came from a marina. The algae on those rocks carried a chemical signature tied to the water it grew in, and that signature could be matched against the water in specific marinas around the bay. A pile of trash bags on the ocean floor had just become a map pointing back toward a boat slip. At the same time, the manner of dismemberment gave investigators a second thread. The cuts were clean, deliberate, and consistent. Joints rather than bone. Someone with either medical training or a specific kind of practical experience. Combined with the victim profile, the picture forming on the whiteboard described a person with knowledge of anatomy, access to information about criminal cases, and a boat. Deborah Morgan was still recovering from her own ordeal. She had been engaged to a man who turned out to be the ice truck killer, had woken up strapped to a table in a room he had prepared for her, and had spent the week since sleeping on her brother's couch because her own apartment felt unsafe. She was not in any condition for another serial murder investigation, and she said as much to anyone who would listen. The department put her on the case anyway. Miami Metro also had a structural problem that nobody wanted to say out loud yet. 18 bodies, spread over years, dumped in local water, made up of men the local police had arrested and failed to convict. That is a case with jurisdiction written all over it. Bodies crossing water, victims from multiple counties, a pattern spanning a decade. Once a case looks like that, it stops belonging to one department. For Dexter, the immediate danger was not the 18 bodies. The bodies were anonymous. The danger was the process. Every step of a professional investigation was designed to work backward from anonymous remains toward a person, and he had spent years quietly trusting that no such process would ever begin. His father, Harry, had taught him a code built around never being caught, and the code had assumed the ocean would hold. The ocean had not held. He started making adjustments almost immediately, in small, quiet ways, the way a man checks the locks in a house he suddenly no longer trusts. He thought about the marina. He thought about the security cameras. He thought about the boat sitting in a slip his father had rented decades earlier. All of it was correct, and each item on that list was a thread a patient investigator would eventually pull. The site itself became known inside the show as the underwater graveyard, and the name fit. It was not a random stretch of seabed. It was a place Dexter had chosen years earlier, for specific reasons, and those reasons had all been sound at the time. It was deep enough that recreational divers had no obvious reason to go there. It was far enough from shipping lanes to avoid dredging. It was close enough to shore that a single man on a small boat could reach it, do the work, and be home before anyone noticed. The mistake was not carelessness. The mistake was time. He had used the same location for so long that the volume itself eventually made discovery inevitable. That system had not been his idea originally. Harry Morgan had trained him to dispose of remains at sea, and the entire arrangement was part of a code built by a homicide detective who wanted to keep his adopted son alive and out of prison. Everything about the disposal method reflected a police officer's understanding of how bodies get found on land. Harry had thought about shallow graves, construction sites, and cadaver dogs. He had not thought about recreational diving, marine algae chemistry, or a federal task force with a budget for a marine biologist. The department receiving this case was also not in good condition. Miami Metro had just come through the ice truck killer investigation, which had ended with the killer dead, and a detective from their own homicide division discovered strapped to a table as an intended victim. Morale was low. The press had spent months questioning their competence, and the department had barely finished writing the reports. Then the divers surfaced, and the entire cycle started again, at 3 times the scale. The recovery itself took days, and it was slow, ugly, physical work. Divers went down repeatedly, marked bags, and brought them up one at a time under supervision so the chain of custody would hold. News helicopters circled overhead, filming the boats. Families of missing men started calling the department. Every step of it happened in public, on television, in a city that could not talk about anything else. Inside the field morgue, the scale of what had been recovered stopped being an abstraction. 18 tables, 18 sets of remains in various conditions, some of them years old. Technicians in masks, moving between them with clipboards. The tent had to be kept cold, which is why the air conditioning mattered so much, and which is why a single sabotaged unit could undo everything. Dexter's frozen state through this period is easy to skip past, but it was one of the more interesting choices the show made. A serial killer who cannot kill is a man in withdrawal. His narration in those early episodes described a mounting pressure with nowhere to go, and it bled into everything else in his life. He was short with Rita. He was distracted at work. He made mistakes he would never normally make. The season put him under maximum stress before the investigation even began, which is exactly why the investigation nearly worked. Public opinion made the situation stranger still. Rather than fear, a large part of Miami responded with approval, and that approval hardened as the victim list became public. When people learned that the recovered men included suspects in unsolved murders, the mood shifted from horror to something closer to gratitude. The Dark Defender concept turned an unidentified killer into a comic book hero, complete with a costume and a mission. Officers working the case had to knock on doors and ask questions of people who thought they were hunting a hero. The final detail that made the discovery so dangerous was timing. The remains came up while the department was already assembled, already staffed for a major investigation, and already under a microscope from the press. A year earlier or a year later, the case might have been absorbed slowly by an overworked homicide division. Instead, it arrived at the exact moment Miami Metro needed a win, which guaranteed that every available resource would be thrown at it immediately, and that nobody would be allowed to let it go quiet. The city had a name for the killer, a body count, a recovery site, and a department under pressure, and it had all of it within a matter of days. What it did not have was a single witness, a single fingerprint, or a single person who had ever reported anything unusual about the man who had been doing this for years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Miami Metro was not going to be allowed to run this one alone. A decision had already been made in another city about who would be taking over the room. The man on that plane closed cases nobody else could close, and he was about to walk through the front door of the building where Dexter worked. Section 2. The man they called Special Agent Rockstar. Miami Metro got no real warning about the change. One morning there was a briefing scheduled, and standing at the front of it was a gray-haired man in a plain suit with a mild voice and a folder under his arm. Frank Lundy, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, played by Keith Carradine. He introduced himself to the homicide team in the second episode of Season 2, an episode called Waiting to Exhale, which aired during the season that premiered on September 30th, 2007. The room reacted to him before he said anything of substance. Detectives who had spent their careers in Miami knew exactly who he was, because his name attached to cases that everyone in law enforcement had followed. He was the agent connected to the Green River Killer investigation. He was connected to the DC sniper case. Those are two of the highest-profile serial offender manhunts in American history, and Lundy had a hand in both. Inside a homicide bullpen, that record made him something close to a celebrity, which is exactly why the nickname stuck. Dokes called him the rock star, and he did not mean it kindly. Dexter picked up the phrase in his own internal narration and turned it into Special Agent Rockstar. which he used with the specific bitterness of a man watching his own executioner shake hands with his coworkers. Joey Quinn would later call him Special Agent Grandpa. Deb ended up calling him the Zen Master. Masuka, who found his management style unbearable, compared him to Hitler. The volume of nicknames says a lot about how much space he took up in the building. His opening briefing did something Dexter had not prepared for. Lundy put photographs of the ice truck killer victims on the board next to photographs from the underwater site, and rather than tying them together, he separated them. He explained that these were two different methods, two different mindsets, two different men. Miami Metro had been quietly hoping the new bodies might be old work from a killer already dead. Lundy closed that door in the first 5 minutes. Then he announced that the agencies would be working the case together and that he was building a task force. That word mattered. A task force meant federal resources, federal analysts, federal patients, and a leader who did not answer to Captain Matthews or to the mayor or to the local press cycle. It meant the case would not quietly go cold when the news moved on. Dexter ducked out of that briefing to clear his head. His internal narration described Lundy as the man standing between him and death row, which is about as direct as the show ever got about what was at stake. Not exposure, not humiliation, execution. Florida had a death penalty. Dexter had 18 recovered bodies with his signature on them, and the federal government had just assigned its best serial killer hunter to find him. What made Lundy dangerous was not aggression. He was one of the calmest characters the series ever produced. He spoke softly. He never raised his voice. He did not threaten people, and he did not perform authority the way Matthews did. He ate lunch at 1 o'clock every day without exception, and refused to move the appointment for anyone. He carried a small tape recorder and dictated observations into it as he walked. He was the least theatrical person in every room he entered, which is precisely why nobody could get a read on him. There is a scene early in the season that explains his entire method in about 90 seconds. Lundy and Deb drive out to a marina as part of the investigation. When they arrive, Lundy sits down on the dock, takes his shoes and socks off, complains about the Miami heat, and starts eating his lunch. Deb tries to talk strategy and gets nowhere. She gets frustrated enough to walk away. Then Lundy stops her and lays out everything he has noticed in the few minutes he has been sitting there. No rental identification on any of the hulls, so it is not a commercial marina. Upkeep is poor. The perimeter is not secure. The lighting is bad. Anyone could come out here at night and do whatever they wanted without being seen. He tells her he is going to put the marina under round-the-clock surveillance, along with 2 others, as soon as he finishes eating. That is the whole character. He appeared to be doing nothing, and while he appeared to be doing nothing, he had already solved the immediate problem. Deb sat down next to him, took off one boot, and put her foot in the water. It is the moment she decided he was worth learning from. His approach to Deb was its own piece of strategy. She had been assigned to the task force and she wanted off it immediately. She went to him directly and asked what was taking so long to get her reassigned. She told him she was the last person who should be anywhere near another serial killer investigation after what she had survived. Lundy told her the opposite. He explained that he had specifically wanted her because she had a first-hand look inside the mind of a serial killer, which nobody else on the task force had, and he suggested that she was in a position to help catch someone even worse than the man who had nearly killed her. She went back to the interviews. That exchange was not comfort. It was recruitment. Lundy understood that the trauma she wanted to run from was also the most valuable piece of investigative experience in the building, and he told her so in a way that made her feel useful rather than used. It worked, and it also started something neither of them planned. Off the case, he was a widower. His wife Connie had died of cancer 2 years before he arrived in Miami. He mentioned it plainly, without drama, in a conversation about Deb's dating life, and then he said he had already had one perfect relationship and did not think he would ever have another. He told her she should keep dating. He told her he probably should not. He ran a background check on a man she was seeing without being asked, then handed her the results when she needed them, which turned out to reveal that the man was a children's book author rather than someone trying to profit off her story. The The show also quietly built him as a professional descendant of real people. Fans and commentators have long pointed out that Lundy strongly resembles John Douglas, the FBI agent who pioneered criminal profiling in the United States, helped build the Behavioral Science Unit, and worked on the Green River Killer case. The parallels are hard to miss. Both are calm interviewers rather than interrogators. Both build a personality sketch before they build a suspect list. Both treat pattern as the primary evidence. Casting a soft-spoken 60-year-old as the most dangerous man on the show was a deliberate choice, and it worked because it matched how that kind of investigator actually operates. For Dexter, every single one of those qualities was a problem. He had spent his adult life managing people who reacted to surfaces. Dokes was suspicious but emotional, easy to provoke, and easy to discredit. LaGuerta was political. Matthews cared about headlines. Lundy cared about none of that. He did not care whether Dexter seemed normal. He cared what the evidence indicated, and he was patient enough to wait for it. The task force itself filled out quickly. Angel Batista supervised the Miami Metro personnel inside it. Deb worked victim profiles and interviews. Lieutenant Pascal ran the local side until she was removed from her position. Matthews hovered around the edges early on, making sure the department's contribution to the eventual arrest would be visible when it happened. Federal agents moved into the building and set up their own boards and their own filing. Dexter was folded into the forensic support side of it, handling laboratory work and case scenes on top of his ordinary duties. He was inside the operation, holding the evidence, running the tests, listening to the theories, all while the person the entire room was hunting sat at the desk in the corner writing reports. The casting choice did an enormous amount of the work. Keith Carradine was in his mid-50s when he took the role, with a soft voice, an unhurried delivery, and a face that suggested patience rather than threat. Nothing about him looked like a man who could bring down a serial killer. That mismatch was the point, and it let the show build tension out of politeness. Every scene where Lundy was pleasant to Dexter carried more menace than any confrontation with Dokes, because Dokes announced his suspicion and Lundy never announced anything at all. His method was recognizably drawn from the way behavioral investigators actually work, which is why the character has aged so well. Real profiling is not a psychic reading of a crime scene. It is a set of inferences built from repeated patterns across many cases, combined with the boring parts of investigation, which are records, interviews, timelines, and elimination. Lundy did all of that on screen. He read files, he asked ordinary questions, he noticed what was missing rather than what was present. He built a description of a person out of the decisions the killer had made. The resemblance to John Douglas is the one most often pointed out, and it is a strong one. Douglas was one of the FBI agents who built criminal profiling into a formal discipline within the Bureau, helped establish its behavioral science work, and contributed to the Green River Killer investigation, which the show explicitly attaches to Lundy's record. Both men are known for calm interviewing rather than pressure. Both approach a case by asking what kind of person would make these specific choices. Giving Lundy that lineage told the audience immediately what kind of opponent he was without needing to explain it. The task force also changed the show structurally. For its first season, Dexter had operated in a world where he was the only person who understood what was happening. He narrated, he predicted, and he was always several steps ahead of the department he worked for. Lundy broke that arrangement. Suddenly, there was a second intelligence in the building, capable of reading a crime scene the way Dexter read one, and the audience could no longer assume Dexter had the best view of the situation. His effect on Deb went beyond the romance, and it is one of the most quietly generous pieces of writing in the series. She came into that season damaged, doubting her own judgment, unable to trust her instincts after being deceived so completely by the ice truck killer. Lundy treated her instincts as evidence. He gave her real assignments, he listened to her conclusions, and he told her that her worst experience was the most valuable thing she brought to the room. She became a better detective in his orbit, and that improvement stayed with her long after he was gone. The age difference between them drew a great deal of commentary at the time, and continues to. Some viewers found the pairing unnecessary, and thought a mentor relationship would have created the same conflict without the romance. Others found it the most emotionally convincing relationship either character ever had. What is not in dispute is that the relationship gave the season its final emotional stakes, because it put the person hunting Dexter inside his family in a way no professional adversary ever could. For Dexter personally, the arrival of Lundy created a fear he had never experienced. Dokes was a threat he could manage, because Dokes had no institutional support and a reputation for hostility. Lundy had the opposite of both. He was trusted, calm, credible, and permanent, and he had come to Miami for exactly one reason. One more detail about how the show introduced him matters here. Lundy almost never raised his voice at anyone across his entire run on the series. Not at Deb, not at Matthews, not at Masuka, and not at Dexter. The only time he came close was when he told LaGuerta to cooperate or lose her job, and even then, he said it flatly. A show about a man whose entire survival depends on reading people put him opposite an opponent who gave away nothing at all. Everything about him was designed to make Dexter uncomfortable, and it worked immediately. For the first time in his life, Dexter Morgan was sharing a building with someone who was better at reading people than he was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Being inside the room was the only protection Dexter had left, and he understood that from the first day. He also understood something worse. The access that let him watch the investigation would eventually put the evidence of his own crimes into his own hands, with a federal agent standing behind him. Section 3. Working the case against himself. The first thing Dexter did was inventory his own exposure, and the list was longer than he wanted it to be. His boat sat in a slip at Coral Cove Marina, a slip his father Harry had rented years earlier, and which Dexter had simply kept. The marina had security cameras. The marina had a logbook. The marina had neighbors who recognized his face and his schedule. The rocks he used to weight the bags had come from the water around that marina. His kill sites left trace evidence. His tools were in a bag on that boat, and every single body the divers had pulled up carried the same cut pattern that could be traced back to the way he had been taught to work. He handled it the way he handled everything, which was methodically and without visible panic. He moved the boat to a different location. He changed his dumping ground entirely, switching from the shallow shelf near Bay Harbor to the Gulf Stream, a powerful current running north along the Florida coast that carries anything dropped into it far out into open ocean. Whatever went into the Gulf Stream was not coming back to Miami. It was the correct fix, and it was also an admission that his father's original system had been flawed from the beginning. Then he found out about the video. Marina security had recorded footage of him cleaning his boat, and that footage had been collected as part of the investigation. Not because anyone suspected him, but because the task force had ordered surveillance and record collection at 3 marinas as a matter of routine. The file was sitting in the queue at Miami Metro, waiting to be reviewed by someone. If a technician sat down and watched it, they would see the man from the forensics lab scrubbing down a boat at a marina that had just been named as a possible origin point for 18 bodies. Dexter solved it by pulling the fire alarm at the station. The building emptied. People moved toward the stairwells, and in the confusion, he got to a terminal and deleted the video file before anyone had a chance to view it. It worked. It was also the moment the season turned him into something the show had not shown before, which was a man improvising under time pressure rather than following a plan his father had written for him. The deeper problem was the field morgue. 18 sets of remains, preserved in a climate-controlled tent, waiting for a marine biologist and a team of forensic technicians to strip every possible piece of information out of them. Algae, water chemistry, tool marks, trace fibers. Each body was a document, and the task force was reading all 18 at once. Every day those remains stayed intact was another day someone might find something that pointed at a specific person. The idea came from a throwaway comment. Batista, standing outside the morgue in brutal Miami heat, complained to Dexter that it was so hot he could melt. Dexter, in narration, wished the bodies would melt away. Then he realized he could arrange exactly that. That night, he broke into the field morgue and destroyed the air conditioning unit, staging the damage so it would look like a garbage collection truck had backed into it. It was a small, ugly, entirely practical act of sabotage. The next morning, Masuka, Lundy, and Dr. Pena arrived to collect specimens and found the tent flooded and the remains reduced to unusable material. Weeks of forensic work gone, and 18 victims turned into something no laboratory could analyze. That single act shows how far Dexter was willing to go once the code was no longer protecting him. He had spent the season unable to kill because he was being watched. He had no such hesitation about destroying 18 dead men to protect himself, including men whose families had just been notified that remains had been found. The show did not moralize about it. It simply let the audience watch him do it and understand what kind of self-preservation he was capable of. He was also being handed access that nobody in his position should have had. The task force needed forensic support, and Dexter was Miami Metro's blood spatter analyst. He was assigned to collect bone marrow samples from the recovered remains. He worked crime scenes tied to the case. He sat in briefings where his own psychology was being described out loud by a federal profiler, taking notes, occasionally offering an opinion. There is a strange kind of tension in watching a man run the forensic analysis on his own crimes, because every piece of evidence he handles is a decision. Report it accurately and risk pointing at himself. Report it inaccurately and risk being caught in a lie later when someone re-examines the work. Dexter chose accuracy almost every time because accurate work drew no attention, and attention was the only thing that could kill him. Then a copycat appeared, and the entire situation got worse in a way Dexter had not anticipated. A man named John Henry came forward claiming he had been attacked by the Bay Harbor butcher and had survived. Police investigated. The details did not match. The work was sloppy, the method was wrong, the restraint was clumsy, and the whole thing looked like someone imitating what he had read in the newspaper rather than someone following a practiced routine. The real attacker was a man named Ken Olson, who had decided the butcher had given him permission. For the task force, the copycat was a complication. For Dexter, it was an existential threat, and Lundy explained why, without knowing who he was talking to. Lundy told Deb that if the copycat killed again, the FBI would take full control of the case. Not a joint task force, not shared jurisdiction, full federal control, which meant more agents, more resources, and a national profile that would make the investigation impossible to survive. Dexter's solution was direct. He found Olson, killed him, dismembered him using his own method, and then did something he had never done in his life. He left the body where it would be found. He staged the remains in the railroad car Olson had picked out for his own next victim and walked away, leaving the pieces for the police to discover. It was read exactly the way he intended. Investigators concluded that the Bay Harbor butcher had killed a copycat as a warning to anyone else thinking about imitating him. It reinforced the profile the task force was building of a rigid, controlled, territorial offender with a strict personal set of rules. It also kept the FBI from taking the case away from Lundy, which Dexter had calculated was the safer of two bad outcomes. That calculation is worth sitting with, because it shows how far his thinking had shifted. He was now actively managing the shape of the investigation into himself. He was choosing which version of the manhunt he preferred and taking action to produce it. Rather than hiding from the case, he had started steering it. Dokes made all of it harder. Through this entire stretch, the sergeant was still watching him. He followed Dexter to crime scenes. He tracked his movements. He confronted him in parking lots and hallways. At one point, he brought up Harry Morgan directly, revealing information about Dexter's father that shook him. Dokes had no profile, no task force, and no federal authority, and he was closer to the truth than anyone in the building. The two threats were completely different in shape. Lundy was building a case from the outside in, working from evidence toward a person. Dokes had started from the person and was working outward, hunting for something that would justify what his instincts had already told him. Dexter was being squeezed between a methodical stranger and an obsessive colleague, and neither one could be discredited without the other noticing. Meanwhile, his personal life was collapsing in a way that made everything more dangerous. Rita had caught him in a lie and pushed him into Narcotics Anonymous, believing he was hiding an addiction. He went along with it because it gave him a story that explained his secrecy. Inside those meetings, he met Lila, an English artist who latched onto him with an intensity that quickly became a problem of its own. She would end up mattering enormously to how the case ended, though at this point in the season, she looked like nothing more than a bad decision. Deb noticed the change in her brother and read it as stress from the case, which everyone in the building was showing. The department was working 18 homicides while the public cheered for the killer, while a federal task force reorganized their bullpen, and while their captain used the investigation as campaign material. Nobody had time to wonder why the blood spatter analyst seemed distracted. The task force, meanwhile, kept grinding forward at the speed Lundy preferred, which was slow and total. All 18 bodies were identified. 13 carried criminal records. Lundy noticed that some of the victims had no record at all, which broke the neat pattern everyone else had settled on, and he assigned Batista to investigate one of those cases, a man named Oscar Sota. Deb worked through the remaining names and found that one of the victims without a conviction had still been suspected of murder. That finding was quietly devastating for Dexter. It meant the task force had correctly identified the actual rule he operated under: not convicted criminals, guilty people. Someone in that room now understood that the killer had access to information about who was guilty regardless of what the courts had decided, and that narrowed the field of possible suspects dramatically. The heat wave running through Miami that season became a running joke in Dexter's narration, and also a decent description of his situation. Week 3 of the investigation, and the agent everyone called a rock star had not thrown up his hands and admitted defeat. He had not gotten frustrated. He had not moved on to another case. He simply kept coming to work, eating lunch at 1 o'clock, and reducing the size of the haystack. The show made a running joke out of the heat that season, and the heat kept doing narrative work. Miami was in the middle of the worst heat wave in years. The field morgue needed constant cooling. Tempers in the station were short, and Dexter's own narration used the weather as a way of describing the pressure closing around him. The heat is also what handed him the idea for the sabotage, since a broken air conditioner in that climate did not need to look like anything other than bad luck. Working the case from inside also gave him something no fugitive normally gets, which is a live feed of the investigation into himself. He knew which marinas were under surveillance. He knew when the algae results came back. He knew what the profile said and how it was changing. Every briefing was an intelligence report delivered directly to the target. That advantage is the single largest reason he survived the season, and it is also the reason Lundy's eventual conclusion about a law enforcement insider was so dangerous. The advantage and the vulnerability were the same fact. The copycat sequence deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is the clearest look at Dexter's actual priorities. Ken Olsen had attacked a man named John Henry and left him alive, sloppily, with none of the care that defined the real work. In practical terms, Olsen made the Bay Harbor butcher look worse rather than better, and Olsen's continued activity would have handed the case entirely to the federal government. So Dexter killed him. What matters is how he did it. He dismembered Olsen using his own method, and then deliberately left the remains where police would find them, staged inside the railroad car Olsen had prepared for his next victim. That was a message, and Dexter knew it would be read as one. For a man who had spent his entire life ensuring nothing he did was ever seen, choosing to speak to the police through a body was an enormous shift. It also fed the profile. Investigators concluded that the killer was territorial, controlled, and had a rigid personal code that other people were not permitted to imitate. Every one of those conclusions was correct, and every one of them was a gift Dexter handed to Frank Lundy while trying to protect himself. Underneath all of this ran the season's actual theme, which was Dexter losing control of his own story. The first season had been about discovering where he came from. This one was about discovering that the arrangement he had inherited from Harry was not permanent, not perfect, and not entirely his. He had been handed a code as a child and had followed it without ever stress testing it. The Bay Harbor butcher investigation was the stress test. That is also why the Leela storyline sits where it does. The recovery meetings had started as a convenient cover and turned into something else entirely. Inside them, he met a woman who insisted he stop hiding, stop apologizing, and accept what he was. She was telling him to abandon Harry's code at the exact moment the code was already failing him, and he listened, which is how a personal mistake ended up shaping a federal investigation. By the halfway point of the season, Dexter was running 3 simultaneous operations. He was managing the forensic investigation into his own crimes, managing a police sergeant conducting private surveillance on him, and managing a girlfriend and a mistress who each knew a different version of him. Any one of those going wrong would have finished him. By the time the Marina results came back, Dexter had already burned through most of his good options. He had moved the boat, destroyed the video, wrecked the morgue, and killed a copycat to keep the case in local hands. Each of those moves solved an immediate problem and left a trace behind, and traces accumulate. A man who takes 5 emergency actions in a month has created 5 new things that can be noticed by someone patient enough to keep a list. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The algae on those rocks pointed at water Dexter knew by name. 3 marinas were about to be narrowed down to 1, and the person who said that name out loud in the briefing was not a federal agent at all. It was someone at that table who had spent her childhood on a boat tied up in that exact slip. Section 4. The Profile Tightens. Dr. Manny Pena delivered his findings to the task force, and they were more specific than anyone expected. The algae growing on the rocks, recovered from inside the body bags, had a chemical fingerprint. Algae responds to the water it lives in, and the water in a marina reflects the pollutants that collect there, which in turn depend on how much fresh water flows through the basin. The samples pointed to a freshwater marina with restricted water circulation, somewhere near a populated stretch of Biscayne Bay rather than out in open water. That single scientific finding converted a coastline into a short list. Batista presented the narrowed results at a task force briefing. Out of every marina in the search area, only 3 had the restricted water flow the samples described. Turkey Creek, Sunset Keys, Coral Cove. 3 names on a whiteboard, and the man they were hunting was sitting somewhere in the building while they were written down. Deb spoke up about the 3rd name, and she did it for the most innocent reason imaginable. Coral Cove was where her father had kept the family boat when she and Dexter were children. She mentioned that Dexter still used the slip. Then she added, correctly, that half the police force kept boats at that marina. Batista backed her up, pointing out that Coral Cove was one of the few marinas in the area a person could actually afford on a cop's salary. That exchange is one of the quietest and most brutal moments in the entire season. Deborah Morgan, in front of a federal profiler hunting a serial killer, volunteered her brother's boat slip as a matter of family trivia, and then immediately buried it under a statistical fact that made it meaningless. She was not protecting him. She had no idea there was anything to protect. She was just being thorough, and being thorough happened to save his life. Lundy assigned himself and Deb to work Coral Cove personally, which is how they ended up on that dock with their shoes off. He ordered round-the-clock surveillance on all 3 marinas: cameras, logs, personnel. Anyone who used those slips at unusual hours was now being recorded. Dexter's boat had already been moved, which meant the surveillance caught nothing, but it also meant he could no longer use his own marina for anything at all. The investigation was closing distance faster than Dexter could absorb, and he made a decision that most people in his position would consider insane. He decided to attack the profile itself. The Bay Harbor butcher sent a manifesto to the Miami Tribune, 32 pages of writing, mailed directly to a major newspaper, laying out a worldview and a justification for the killings. It landed in the middle of the task force like a grenade. Newspapers do not sit on documents from active serial killers, and the Tribune intended to publish. Lundy went with Deb to meet the newspaper's lawyer and publisher, and came away with an injunction that stopped publication, at least temporarily. He told the task force that the injunction bought them a window before the media frenzy hit, and he set a goal for the next 48 hours, which was to work through every page of the document. The manifesto went up on whiteboards in the task force room in oversized lettering, so the whole team could read the same lines at the same time. The document was accepted as authentic almost immediately, because it contained 3 victim names that had never been released to the public. Only the killer could have known them. That authentication was exactly what Dexter had engineered. He needed the manifesto to be believed, because a manifesto nobody believed would have been useless. His plan was to poison the profile. If he could plant a personality on the page, a set of motives and grievances and mental habits that did not resemble him at all, then the task force would spend the rest of the investigation looking for a man who did not exist. It was proactive, it was aggressive, and it was the boldest thing he had done since the bodies came up. It backfired completely. Lundy read the manifesto and drew a conclusion Dexter had never considered. The writer, he said, had a background in law enforcement. The way the document discussed cases, the way it referenced procedure, the specific things it took for granted, and the specific things it explained, all pointed to someone who had worked inside the system. And then Lundy said the part that made the whole room go quiet. The man they were looking for might be one of them. That single deduction changed everything about the shape of the manhunt. Up to that point, the task force had been searching outward, sorting through a city of 2 million people. Now the search turned inward, toward a building full of colleagues. Lundy called in additional FBI agents to help handle a suspect pool made up of police officers and civilian department staff. The Miami Metro side of the task force reacted badly, which was human and predictable. Deb did not want to believe it. Batista did not want to believe it. Nobody in a police department wants to hear a federal agent explain that the man who dismembered 18 people has been drinking coffee in their break room. Masuka's response was to compare Lundy to Hitler, which was less an argument than a way of saying that the mood in the building had turned poisonous. Lundy did not soften the position or apologize for it. He built out the internal suspect framework and started working it the same way he worked everything else. Who had access to case files? Who knew which suspects had walked free? Who had the technical knowledge? Who had a boat? For Dexter, the manifesto had achieved the exact opposite of its purpose. He had tried to hand the profiler a false portrait, and instead, he had handed him a fingerprint. Every attempt he made to manage the investigation from the inside kept narrowing the field toward the small number of people who could have made that attempt in the first place. Then came the interview, and it is the best scene in the season for understanding why Lundy was dangerous. Lundy asked Deb to look into one of the victims, a drug dealer named Anthony Rodrigo. Rodrigo had been arrested for murder and had walked free because of the blood evidence. On April 16, 2002, shortly after his release, he disappeared. Lundy pulled the file and noticed who had done the blood work on the original case. It was Dexter. He asked Dexter to sit down with him and talk about it. There was no interrogation room, no recorder on the table, no accusation. It was a conversation between two professionals about an old case. Lundy pointed out that the blood work had later been proven wrong. Dexter, thinking on his feet, argued that the analysis had actually been correct and started explaining the technical reasoning behind it. Lundy dismantled every point he made. Calmly, without raising his voice, without any obvious pleasure in it, he countered each argument until Dexter had nowhere left to stand. Eventually, Dexter had to give ground and admit that he had made a mistake because he had been overworked at the time. He confessed to incompetence in order to avoid confessing to murder, and he had to do it in front of a man who had almost certainly noticed how hard he fought before he gave in. That scene is why so many viewers have spent years arguing that Lundy knew. There is no confirmation anywhere in the series, and the argument stays a theory. But the sequence is hard to ignore. He pulled the file. He noticed the analyst. He asked for the meeting. He pushed until the analyst broke, and then he moved on without a word. At the same time, Lundy's relationship with Deb was becoming a real thing rather than a professional partnership. He asked her to dinner, and she accepted. Dinner became an evening at his apartment. Flirting became a kiss. She was decades younger than him. She was still recovering from a serial killer who had chosen her as a victim, and she had found the first person since her father who made her feel like a competent investigator. The show treated it seriously, and it did the character an enormous amount of good, even while it made everything more complicated. Dexter's reaction to that news was petty and revealing. He needled his sister about sleeping her way to the top, which was less about Deb and more about the fact that the man hunting him was now inside his family. Deb hit back by insulting his taste in women, meaning Lila, which was an accurate shot of her own. What that pairing did structurally was pull Lundy closer to Dexter's life at exactly the moment Dexter needed him further away. Family dinners, casual conversations. A federal profiler who now had social access to Dexter's sister and through her to a lifetime of stories about the Morgan family, Harry Morgan, and the strange quiet boy Harry had adopted. Dexter began to believe Lundy suspected him personally. He said as much in narration. He watched for it in every interaction. He read meaning into the way the man looked at him across a lab bench. Whether or not the suspicion was real, the belief itself was corrosive, because a man who thinks he is being watched starts making the kind of decisions that get people caught. The task force, meanwhile, had its internal suspect list, its marina surveillance, its verified manifesto, and its profile of a law enforcement insider with anatomical knowledge and access to case files. Every one of those descriptors fit Dexter Morgan precisely. They also fit a small number of other people in the building, and one of those people had spent the entire season making himself look guilty for completely unrelated reasons. As a piece of strategy, the manifesto was the most sophisticated thing Dexter attempted all season, and it failed for the most human reason possible. He understood that a profile is built out of the killer's choices, so he tried to fake the choices. He wrote 32 pages designed to project a personality he did not have, and he seeded it with 3 unreleased victim names, specifically so the document would be authenticated rather than dismissed. What he could not fake was the way he thought. A person cannot write 32 pages without revealing how they organize information, what they consider obvious, and what they feel needs explaining. Lundy read the document not for its arguments, but for its assumptions, and the assumptions belonged to someone who had spent years around case files, evidence procedure, and the language police use with each other. The manifesto did not tell Lundy what the killer believed. It told him where the killer worked. The effect inside Miami Metro was immediate and corrosive. Once the task force accepted that the offender was probably in law enforcement, every person in that building became a possible suspect to the federal agents standing in it. Detectives who had spent their entire careers there were asked about their whereabouts. Access logs were reviewed. Boat ownership was checked. The Miami Metro members of the task force found themselves helping investigate their own colleagues, and the resentment showed in every scene. Masuka comparing Lundy to a dictator was played as a joke, but it captured something real about the atmosphere. A federal agent who had arrived as a celebrity had become, within weeks, the man who thought one of them was a monster. Deb and Batista both pushed back on the theory, and their resistance was not stupidity. It was the entirely normal reaction of people being asked to suspect the person sitting across the desk from them. The Rodrigo interview is the moment the season's 2 threats intersect, and its construction is elegant. Lundy did not summon Dexter to an interrogation room. He asked for a conversation. He did not accuse him of anything. He asked about a piece of old forensic work. He let Dexter argue, and then he took the argument apart, point by point, until the only exit available was an admission of professional failure. For Dexter, conceding incompetence was the cheapest possible price, and he paid it instantly. But a profiler watching a man fight that hard over a routine analytical error, in a case where the freed suspect later turned up dismembered, is a profiler collecting data. Whether Lundy filed that data as suspicion or as nothing at all is the question the series never answers. The relationship with Deb complicated the investigation in ways neither of them acknowledged out loud. Lundy was now sharing meals, evenings, and eventually a bed with the sister of a man on his internal suspect pool. He was hearing stories about Harry Morgan, about the Morgan household, about a brother who had always been a little strange and a little distant. Any of those details could have been the thread that unraveled everything, and none of them were, because Deb told them the way any sister tells family stories. Dexter's paranoia during this stretch reached a level that started producing errors. He read significance into ordinary interactions. He second-guessed his own reports. He watched Lundy watching him, and could not tell whether he was seeing surveillance or politeness. That paranoia, more than any piece of evidence, is what pushed him toward the aggressive moves that made his position worse. The profile at this point could be read out loud as a description of one specific person: male, comfortable with anatomy, access to case files and evidence, knowledge of which suspects had escaped conviction, familiar with police procedure and its language, in possession of a boat kept at a poorly secured marina, operating for years without a single reported witness. Nobody in that building said the name, and every single line of it belonged to the man refilling the coffee pot. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the FBI built its profile from the outside, one man had already skipped every step of that process. No evidence, no task force, no authority to investigate anyone. What he had was a decade of instinct about a coworker nobody else looked at twice, and he was about to open the one place nobody was supposed to look. Section 5. The Sergeant Who Never Needed a Profile. James Dokes had been suspicious of Dexter Morgan for years before a single body ever surfaced. There was no case file behind it, and no evidence supporting it. There was only a feeling, repeated daily, that the polite forensic technician who brought donuts to the office and smiled at everyone was wrong in a way nobody else could see. Dokes had said it out loud many times, and every time he said it, he sounded like a man with a personal grudge rather than an investigator with a lead. His background explained why he trusted that feeling so completely. Dokes had served in special forces before he became a police officer, which meant he had spent time around men trained to kill and had done a fair amount of killing himself. He recognized something in Dexter that his colleagues did not have the frame of reference to notice. His instinct was not built out of forensic training. It was built out of the specific experience of having been in rooms with dangerous people and having learned what they look like when they are being pleasant. The problem was that his personality made him impossible to take seriously. Dokes was aggressive, profane, quick to anger, and openly hostile toward Dexter in front of witnesses. He got into confrontations. He picked fights with superiors. He carried himself like a man, permanently one bad moment away from doing something that would end his career. When a man like that says a coworker is a monster, the department hears a grudge. Season 2 opened with Dokes acting on that instinct with total commitment. He parked outside Dexter's apartment. He followed him to crime scenes. He tailed his car at night. He turned up in places Dexter had no reason to expect him. That surveillance is the reason Dexter could not kill anyone in the early part of the season, which is why the show could open with a serial killer in a state of enforced paralysis. Dokes had accomplished on his own, with no warrant and no support, what an entire federal task force never managed. He had stopped the Bay Harbor butcher from killing. He paid for it constantly. His obsession with Dexter cost him standing in the department. It damaged his working relationship with LaGuardia, who had been one of the few people consistently in his corner. It made him look unstable at a moment when the department needed to look professional in front of federal agents. Every hour he spent watching Dexter was an hour he was not spending on his actual caseload, and everyone noticed. At one point, he confronted Dexter with something about Harry Morgan, information about the man who raised him that Dexter had not known and did not want to hear. It landed hard, because Harry was the foundation of everything Dexter believed about himself, and Dokes had just cracked it. That confrontation showed how deep Dokes had dug. He had not simply been watching Dexter. He had been researching him, going back into department history, pulling on threads connected to a detective who had died years earlier. When Lundy's investigation turned inward, toward law enforcement, Dokes ended up in an interview chair like everyone else. It was not a formal interrogation. Lundy did not treat him as the prime suspect at that point. What Lundy had noticed was that Dokes had worked several of the Bay Harbor butcher's eventual victims as cases and had never gotten a conviction on any of them. That pattern was worth a conversation, because a police officer who repeatedly failed to convict the men who later turned up dismembered is exactly the kind of person a profiler wants to talk to. The interview did something Lundy could not have predicted. In the course of the conversation, Dokes learned that Anthony Rodrigo had walked free specifically because of faulty blood work. He asked who had done the blood work. The answer was Dexter. Everything Dokes had been carrying for years snapped into place in a single second. He had known something was wrong with Dexter. Now he had a mechanism. The forensic analyst who handled the blood evidence was in a position to decide which suspects walked out of the building and which ones went to prison. A man with that job and that mind could build his own list of guilty men who had escaped, and he could do it with department resources, on department time, with nobody looking over his shoulder. Dokes got up and left the interview immediately. Lundy, one of the most perceptive investigators in the country, watched a man walk out of his conversation, carrying the solution to the entire case, and had no idea what had just happened. What Dokes did next was illegal, and it worked. He broke into Dexter's apartment. He went through the place carefully, room by room, looking for anything that would justify what he already believed. He found nothing in the obvious places, because Dexter was careful about obvious places. Then he checked behind the air conditioning unit. Inside was a wooden box. Inside the box were 46 glass microscope slides, each one holding a single dried smear of blood, each one labeled and filed neatly beside the others. Trophies, one from every person Dexter had killed. That moment is one of the most important in the entire series, and it happened without a warrant, without a task force, without marine biology, without a manifesto, and without a profile. The FBI had spent months and enormous resources and had narrowed a city down to a category of people. Dokes had used a hunch, a locked door, and a screwdriver. He took the box. That decision would destroy him. Dokes had physical evidence of 46 murders in his possession, obtained through an illegal search, held by an officer with a documented history of hostility toward the man he was accusing. Any competent defense attorney would have taken that chain of custody apart in an afternoon. He knew it. He needed something else, something that would let him present the slides in a way that would survive, and so rather than turning them in immediately, he held on to them and went hunting for confirmation. He followed Dexter out to the Everglades, to a small wooden building hidden in the trees with no neighbors and no witnesses, and a plastic-sheeted room whose purpose was obvious from the doorway. He had finally found the proof he had chased for years. He also found Dexter, and Dexter had the advantage of preparation. Dokes ended up unconscious, and when he woke up, he was inside a steel cage in the middle of a swamp, with the man he had been hunting for years standing on the other side of the bars. The scenes that follow are among the strongest the show ever produced, because they are not really about a captive and a captor. They are two men who recognize each other. Dokes, sitting on the floor of a cage in the Everglades, was completely calm about the facts. He told Dexter what he was. He was not frightened and he was not begging. He was furious about being right. The show also refused to let Dokes be a clean hero, and that refusal is what makes the arc land. Dokes had killed people. He had killed in Special Forces operations, and he had killed in the line of duty, and by his own account, some of those killings had been closer to preference than to necessity. He had a darkness of his own that he had managed by putting on a badge and pointing it in an approved direction. Dexter had a darkness he managed by putting on a badge and pointing it in an unapproved one. The cage scenes let both men see that reflection. Dokes made an argument that Dexter struggled with. He pushed him toward turning himself in. He suggested Dexter could stop, could confess, could let the system deal with what he was. And for a stretch of episodes, Dexter seriously considered it. That is the strangest thing about the entire Bay Harbor butcher case. The closest anyone ever came to stopping Dexter Morgan was not through evidence, arrest, or trial. It was one man in a cage talking him toward it. Meanwhile, Miami Metro had a missing sergeant on its hands, and the task force had no idea what to make of it. Dokes had left the interview abruptly. Dokes had not reported for duty. Dokes had a documented history of hostility, a record of unresolved cases connected to the victims, and a personality profile that matched what the task force had built. He also had no alibi, because he had spent the last several weeks conducting an off-the-books surveillance operation he could not admit to. Everything about Dokes now looked exactly like guilt, and none of it had been arranged by Dexter yet. The frame was already half built by Dokes himself, out of nothing but the decision to chase the truth alone. LaGuerta was the only person who refused the story from the beginning. She knew him. She had worked beside him for years. She had covered for him more than once, and her certainty about his character was as unshakable as Dokes' certainty about Dexter. She would spend the rest of the season fighting a case that everyone else considered closed, and she would keep fighting it for years afterward, long after everyone else had stopped listening. The relationship between Dokes and LaGuerta gave his story its emotional weight, and it explains why his fall hit the show so hard. She had protected him more than once. She had smoothed over incidents that should have ended his career. She trusted his instincts even when she did not agree with his methods, and he trusted hers. When the department turned on him, she was the only person who did not, and that loyalty is what eventually destroyed her too. His position in the series was also unusual in a way that is easy to underestimate. Dokes was the audience surrogate. Everyone watching knew exactly what Dexter was, and everyone watching had to sit through episode after episode of characters failing to notice. Dokes noticed. He was the only person in that world who reacted the way a viewer would react, and the show punished him for it relentlessly, first by making nobody believe him, then by making him look unstable, and finally by putting his face on the news as the man who did all of it. A professional truth sits underneath his arc, and the show handled it well. Institutions are built to distrust exactly the kind of certainty Dokes had. A police officer who fixates on a colleague without evidence is a liability, and every rule that exists to stop that behavior exists for good reasons. Those rules protect innocent people from harassment by officers with grudges. In this specific case, those same rules protected a serial killer, and the show let both things be true at once. The cage conversations in the Everglades gave Eric King the best material of his run on the series. Sitting on the floor of a steel enclosure, stripped of his badge, his gun, and any realistic hope, Dokes was still the most morally clear character on screen. He had been right, and being right had put him in a cage. He knew Dexter would eventually have to make a decision about him, and he refused to make that decision easier by pleading. He also understood what he was looking at better than anyone else ever had, and he said it plainly. He recognized the difference between the version of Dexter that came to work and the version standing in front of him, and he described that difference without any of the sympathy the audience had been trained into by 2 seasons of narration. From inside the cage, Dexter was not a complicated man managing an inherited condition. He was a killer who had found a way to keep his job. What makes the whole thing tragic, rather than merely sad, is that every choice Dokes made was defensible. Following his instinct was defensible. Searching the apartment was illegal, but understandable given what he believed. Holding the slides rather than turning them in immediately was a mistake, but it was a mistake made by a man who correctly understood that his own credibility was the weakest part of his case. He was careful, and being careful is exactly what put him alone in a swamp with no witnesses. The show never let the audience forget that Dokes had done the impossible. Every serious threat Dexter faced across 8 seasons came from someone who got close by accident, by proximity, or by luck. Dokes got close on purpose, alone, against the advice of everyone around him, while holding down a full caseload. He is the only character in the entire franchise who identified Dexter Morgan correctly, from nothing but observation, and then went and found the proof. His certainty was never rewarded, never confirmed publicly, and never written down anywhere that mattered. It existed entirely between 2 men, one of whom controlled the evidence, and the other of whom controlled nothing at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dexter now held the only piece of hard evidence that had ever existed against him, and a federal task force upstairs was looking for exactly that object. Rather than destroying it, he made a decision that no profiler had a category for. He decided to hand it to them, wrapped around another man's name, and then volunteer to analyze it himself. Section 6. 46 slides and the wrong name. Dexter came home, checked behind the air conditioning unit out of routine, and found nothing there. The box was gone. In that moment, he did the arithmetic every viewer was doing along with him. 46 slides, 46 murders. Physical evidence, labeled and organized, sitting in someone else's hands. He assumed Lundy had it, because assuming the worst was the only rational option. Then federal agents knocked on his door with orders to bring him to the station. The show played that walk as an ending. Dexter did not run, did not fight, did not improvise. He went with them calmly, and his narration had the tone of a man who had finished a long argument with himself. He had spent the season being hunted by a profiler and a sergeant at the same time, and now the knock had come. He rode to the station, accepting that his life was over. Inside, Lundy and Captain Matthews had the box on the table in front of him. Dexter looked at it and said the only true thing he could say safely, which was that the slides were trophies. It was a professional observation. It was also a confession delivered in the third person, and nobody in the room heard it that way, because Lundy and Matthews then told him who their prime suspect was: James Dokes. The scene works because the audience understands the ground shifting under Dexter faster than he does. The two men across the table laid out their reasoning like a closing argument. Dokes had personally investigated several of the Bay Harbor Butcher's victims before those men disappeared, and had never secured a conviction on any of them. Dokes had a documented history of violence. Dokes had a special forces background, which supplied both the anatomical competence and the psychological capacity the profile required. Dokes matched the law enforcement background Lundy had extracted from the manifesto. Dokes fit the picture of a murderous vigilante almost perfectly. And that morning, Dokes had flown out of the country. The task force had gotten a warrant to search his vehicle at the airport, and the slides had been in the trunk. None of that happened by accident. Dokes was not on any plane. Dokes was in a steel cage in the Everglades. Dexter had taken his car, taken back the box, driven the vehicle to the airport, and used one of Dokes' own fake identities to create a paper trail showing him leaving the country. A sergeant with a special forces past, keeping a set of alternate identities, was entirely believable, and that believability was the hinge the whole frame swung on. Dexter, sitting in that room, listened to a federal profiler explain a version of events that fit every piece of evidence, satisfied every element of the profile, and pointed at a man who was not there to argue. His narration described being amazed at how well the story held together. He went along with it. He told them he had always sensed something off about Dokes, which explained why the sergeant had spent years antagonizing him. Every word of that was true. He simply reversed the direction of it. Lundy then did something that is painful to watch on a rewatch. Believing that Dokes might come after the forensic analyst who had helped build the case, he assigned a protective FBI detail to Dexter. The federal government put agents outside the Bay Harbor Butcher's apartment to keep him safe from the man who had figured out what he was. Matthews made it worse in the name of departmental reputation. Rather than sending the slides to an outside laboratory where an independent analyst might have handled them, he ordered the forensic work kept in-house so Miami Metro could control the narrative around one of its own sergeants being named a serial killer. Then he named a lead technician for the analysis. He named Dexter. That is the structural center of the entire season. The Bay Harbor Butcher was placed in official charge of analyzing the physical evidence of the Bay Harbor Butcher's murders, with federal technicians assigned to assist him and take his instructions. Dexter wiped the box down for fingerprints as a matter of course, since as lead technician, he had a professional reason to handle it. FBI staff came to him for direction on how they wanted the work sequenced. His narration barely concealed how much he enjoyed it. The analysis produced exactly what he wanted it to produce, because it was honest. He matched 18 of the 46 slides to the 18 recovered bodies. The remaining 28 were matched against missing persons files, and every one of them came back attached to a name connected to unsolved or unpunished violence. Alleged killers who had disappeared over a period of years. His own kill list, cataloged and entered into the record under another man's name. Along the way, the analysis yielded 12 additional Bay Harbor Butcher victims that the task force had not previously known about. The number attached to Dokes kept climbing, and every increase made the case against him look more overwhelming. LaGuerta quietly obtained that list of 12 names from Batista because she had already decided she was going to fight this. The manhunt itself went national in tone. Lundy planned to release the story to the press, which meant putting a Miami Metro sergeant's face on television as the most prolific serial killer in the city's history. LaGuerta was outraged and confronted him directly. Lundy did not negotiate. He told her to cooperate with the investigation or risk her job. It was the hardest edge the character ever showed, and it came from the fact that he believed he had his man and would not let internal loyalty slow down an arrest. LaGuerta pushed Deb to intervene with Lundy on the press question. Deb refused. The two women argued, and in the middle of it, Deb blurted out that she was sleeping with Lundy, which put a relationship they had been keeping private into the open in the worst possible way. Deb then found something in the phone records. Dokes had called LaGuerta shortly after the manhunt launched. Lundy told Deb to confront her about it, arguing that she knew LaGuerta better than he did and that the experience would be good for her. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he would be leaving Miami once the case closed, which unsettled Deb far more than the assignment did. LaGuerta eventually brought Lundy something she believed was decisive. She had an alibi for Dokes covering the disappearance of one of the 12 newly identified victims. She and Dokes had been on a continuous stakeout during that window, and she had personal notes logging it. Lundy refused to accept it, and his reasoning was procedurally sound and personally devastating. LaGuerta had concealed the phone call from Dokes. That concealment had destroyed her credibility as a witness in this investigation, which meant her private stakeout log could not be treated as evidence. Then he told her plainly that by trying to protect Dokes, she had ruined the one real chance anyone had of clearing him. That exchange is one of the saddest pieces of the season, because both of them were right. LaGuerta was right that Dokes was innocent. Lundy was right that she had just made proving it impossible, and the man who had engineered the entire situation was 2 floors away, running the lab work. The physical evidence kept accumulating in the wrong direction. Dexter planted knives where they would be found and tied to Dokes, and they were found. One of Dokes' known aliases was used to rent a car, which produced a location and a direction and turned a manhunt into a chase with an actual trail. Lundy also revealed something in this stretch that made him more human than the profile suggested. Deb, worried about Lila, asked him to run her name through FBI files, which was not what federal databases are for. He did it. When she asked whether his superiors would be angry about it, he said he certainly hoped so. He had been in the bureau long enough to be more loyal to people than to procedure, and that quiet flicker of insubordination is one of the reasons the character stayed likable while doing enormous damage. Underneath all of it, an innocent man was sitting in a cage in the Everglades, with no idea that his name was now on the national news, that his career was gone, that his colleagues had accepted the story, and that the woman fighting for him had accidentally destroyed her own ability to help. The 28 slides that did not match recovered bodies were their own kind of horror, and the show let that number sit without much comment. Each one belonged to a person who had never been found, whose disappearance had been logged somewhere as a missing persons file, and then quietly filed away. Matching them meant reopening dozens of cold cases across years, notifying families, and closing files that had been open for a decade. Dexter did that work himself, professionally and accurately, name by name. Something about the honesty of that analysis is deeply unsettling. He did not falsify a single result. He could not, because falsified work would eventually be checked, and because the accurate results served him better than any lie could. The evidence was real, the matches were real, and the conclusions drawn from them were real. Only the attribution was wrong, and the attribution was the one thing no laboratory test could verify. The press conference and the public naming of a serving police sergeant as a serial killer was the point where the case stopped being an investigation and became an institutional event. Once that name went out, reversing it would have required the department and the bureau to jointly admit that they had destroyed an innocent officer in public. Every hour after the announcement made that admission more expensive, which is a large part of why nobody wanted to hear LaGuerta afterward. Deputy Director Max Adams arriving to take over is the piece of the story that most rewards a rewatch. Jonathan Banks played him with the flat impatience of a senior administrator managing a problem rather than solving a puzzle, and the contrast with Lundy was total. Lundy wanted to understand the killer. Adams wanted the case resolved. Both are legitimate priorities inside a large organization, and the second one is the reason the frame held. Matthews deserves his share of it as well. His decision to keep the forensic analysis in-house rather than sending it to an independent laboratory was made entirely to protect the department's reputation, and it is the single procedural failure that made everything else possible. An outside analyst would not have wiped the box. An outside analyst might have asked why the slides had been stored in a wooden container rather than a case file, or why the labeling system matched a forensic technician's habits rather than a field sergeant's. For Dexter, the strangest part of this stretch was how safe he was and how little he enjoyed the safety. He had federal agents outside his door for his protection. He had the department's confidence. He had the evidence of his own murders under his own control. He also had a man he did not want to kill, locked in a cage in a swamp, a decision he could not delay indefinitely, and a growing certainty that the code his father had given him was not going to survive the week. The manhunt itself continued at full national volume through all of it. Bulletins, checkpoints, airports, border alerts, and a deputy director giving updates, all directed at a man who had not moved more than 6 feet in days. The strangest part of the whole arrangement was how ordinary it looked from the outside. A forensic technician working late in a laboratory, matching blood samples to names, entering results into a database, occasionally answering questions from federal staff assigned to assist him. Anyone walking past that room would have seen a diligent employee closing a difficult case. Nothing about the scene suggested that the analyst was reading his own diary out loud into an evidence log. Every institution involved in that case had an incentive pointing in the same direction, which was toward closing it. The Bureau wanted a resolution. The department wanted the story to end. The public wanted reassurance. Dexter simply gave all 3 of them what they already wanted, and let the momentum carry the rest. By the end of that week, the only person still asking questions about James Dokes was a lieutenant whose credibility had already been destroyed, and the only person who knew the truth was the one signing off on the laboratory results. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dexter still had one problem the frame could not solve. A frame only holds if the man inside it never gets a chance to speak. Out in the swamp, a task force was closing in on a location, and someone else was already driving toward that same cabin with no interest at all in the truth. Section 7. The Cabin in the Everglades. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track deep in the swamp, far enough from any road that a person could shout for a week without being heard. It was small, wooden, half swallowed by vegetation, and completely anonymous. Inside, the room had been lined in plastic sheeting, which is the kind of detail that tells a police officer everything he needs to know within about 2 seconds of walking through the door. Dokes had found it, because he had followed the right man to the right place, and it had cost him everything. The cage was a steel enclosure, large enough to sit in, and not much larger. For days, that cage held a decorated sergeant of the Miami Metro Police Department, while the state of Florida hunted him as the most prolific murderer in the city's history. Dexter brought him food. They argued through the bars. The 2 of them ended up having the most honest conversations either character had in the entire series, because neither one had any reason left to perform. What made those scenes work is that Dokes never begged. He had lost his freedom, his career, his reputation, and any realistic chance of survival, and his dominant emotion was still anger at a system that had believed the wrong man twice. He had been right about Dexter for years, and nobody had listened. Now, he was right about the frame, and there was nobody left to tell. Dexter, standing on the outside of that cage, faced a real problem for the first time in his adult life. His father's code had rules for everything except this. Harry had built the entire structure around avoiding exactly this scenario. There was no instruction for what to do with an innocent police officer who knew the truth. Killing him would break the code outright. Releasing him would end everything. Keeping him in a cage indefinitely was not a plan. It was a delay. So Dexter did something the audience had never seen him do. He seriously considered surrendering. Across this stretch of the season, he circled the idea from every direction. He looked at the life he had assembled, the job, Rita and her children, his sister, and he weighed handing it all over to a courtroom. Dokes pushed him toward it every time they spoke, arguing that Dexter could stop. that he could confess, that the system could be allowed to do what it existed to do. The conversation was the closest thing to therapy Dexter ever received, and it came from a man in a cage who despised him. He came close. He worked through what it would mean to tell the truth to the people who loved him, and what it would do to Deb specifically, and how it would land inside a police department that had already been humiliated once by this case. The season let that possibility hang for long enough that a first-time viewer could believe the show might actually take it. Then he made his choice, and the choice was to finish the frame. Dexter killed a criminal named Jose Garza and dismembered him using his own established method. He then arranged the remains at the cabin so that when the location was eventually found, the physical evidence would tell a specific story. A killer cornered in his hideout, one last victim taken apart in his kill room, everything consistent with the 18 bodies pulled out of the water. It was a piece of narrative engineering built out of a real human being. While that was happening, the federal side of the manhunt was going through its own quiet collapse. The Bureau was not satisfied with how the case was being run. Lundy had spoken to Dokes during the internal interviews and had allowed him to walk out of that conversation, which in hindsight looked like an enormous procedural failure. The most wanted man in America had been sitting in a chair across from the lead investigator and had left the building freely. That, more than anything, was the justification for what happened next. The Bureau assigned Deputy Director Max Adams to take over the Bay Harbor butcher case, played by Jonathan Banks. Lundy was pushed to the side of his own investigation. It is a small piece of the story, and it matters more than its screen time suggests, because it is the most realistic thing the season did with the FBI. A high-profile case that runs long and then embarrasses the agency gets restructured. Leadership changes. Someone senior arrives to be seen taking control. Lundy went from running the room to attending it, and the man now in charge had every institutional reason to want a fast, clean resolution rather than a slow, careful one. That change in leadership is a large part of why the frame survived. Lundy had spent months building a profile from the inside out and had been circling the possibility that the killer was someone comfortable inside the investigation. Adams arrived at the end of the process, inherited a suspect, a mountain of matching evidence, and a fugitive, and had no history with the case to make him uneasy about any of it. Lundy kept working anyway, in the diminished way a sidelined investigator does, running searches, comparing notes, doing small favors. That was when he pulled Lila's background as a favor for Deb and said he hoped it would irritate his new supervisor. The task force eventually determined the cabin's location. The evidence trail Dexter had built, the rented car under a false name, the movements attached to Dokes' aliases, all pointed into the Everglades. Vehicles began moving toward the swamp. Dexter got word and started driving, because he had to reach the cabin before anyone else did, and he had not yet decided what he would do when he arrived. Someone else got there first. Lila had been circling Dexter's life all season, first as a sponsor from the recovery meetings Rita had pushed him into, then as a lover, and finally as something closer to a stalker with a talent for finding leverage. She had noticed the destination stored in his satellite navigation system. She followed it out into the swamp, found the cabin, and broke in. She found James Dokes in a cage. Dokes did the only thing left to do. He told her the truth. He told her Dexter Morgan was the Bay Harbor butcher, expecting that no rational person could hear that and leave a police officer locked up in a swamp. He had spent the entire season desperate for one person to believe him, and the one person who finally did was the worst possible candidate. Lila believed him completely, and her reaction was sympathy for Dexter. She heard that the man she was obsessed with was a serial killer and understood it as a burden he had been carrying alone, a secret so enormous that keeping it explained everything strange about him. She refused to unlock the cage. Then she turned on the gas and set it alight. The cabin exploded with Dokes inside it. He died in the fire, in a cage, in a swamp, with the entire country believing he was a monster, killed by a woman protecting the man who had actually done all of it. Dexter arrived to find the site burning, and initially could not process it. His narration treated it as something close to divine intervention, a problem removed by forces outside his control, at the exact moment he had run out of moves. The next morning, police recovered Dokes' body from the water alongside the dismembered remains of Jose Garza. The evidence read exactly as designed. Deputy Director Adams was satisfied that this proved conclusively that Dokes had been the Bay Harbor butcher, and Frank Lundy was forced to agree with him. That sentence is the entire ending of the case in miniature. Not convinced. Forced to agree. The show gave Lundy that specific framing, and it has fueled a decade of debate among viewers about what he actually believed at the end. The department went further than Dexter had planned. Dokes' death was provisionally listed as a suicide, on the theory that a cornered killer had taken one last victim and then ended his own life rather than face arrest. Dexter learned that detail while cataloging debris from the cabin alongside Masuka, and he was visibly surprised by it. The system had improved his own story without being asked. The Bay Harbor butcher case was closed. 18 bodies recovered from the ocean floor. 46 blood slides, cataloged and matched. A federal task force, a marine biologist, a verified manifesto, months of investigation, and a national manhunt, all resolved with the correct evidence, attached to the wrong name, signed off by a deputy director who had arrived in the final act. The cabin sequences also revealed something about how Dexter had been raised that the series had not fully articulated before. Harry's code had a rule about targets and a rule about evidence, but it had nothing to say about collateral damage. It had never occurred to Harry Morgan that his son might one day be forced to choose between killing an innocent man and being executed by the state, because Harry had built the code to prevent that situation, rather than to survive it. Faced with a gap in the rules, Dexter discovered that the code was a set of habits rather than a moral system. That realization shaped the rest of the series. From this point on, Dexter no longer treated the code as something handed down and fixed. He negotiated with it. He edited it. He justified exceptions. The Bay Harbor butcher case was the last time he behaved like a man, following instructions. Lila's role in the ending has always divided viewers, and the objection is understandable. A season built on careful police procedure and forensic detail resolved itself through the intervention of an unstable outsider who happened to check a navigation system. Some viewers found that unsatisfying, because the investigation deserved a conclusion built out of the investigation. The defense of it is that the show had written itself into a corner deliberately. Dexter could not kill Dokes without ending the character the audience had been asked to follow. He could not release him. He could not keep him. Every road out of that cabin destroyed something the series needed. Having someone else make the decision, someone whose obsession with Dexter had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with possession, is at least thematically coherent. He was saved by the exact relationship that had been ruining his life all season. There is also the detail that Dokes told her the truth and it made no difference. He finally found someone who believed him completely, and belief turned out to be worthless, because what mattered was not whether she accepted the facts but what she wanted. She heard that Dexter was a serial killer, and it made her love him more. That is the bleakest joke the season told. The official ruling made it worse in a way that felt uncomfortably realistic. Listing the death as a suicide meant the file recorded that James Dokes had murdered a man in his hideout and then chosen to die rather than face arrest. It was tidy. It required no further investigation. It also stripped him of any possibility of posthumous doubt, because a suicide reads as an admission. Dexter, cataloging debris from the burned cabin beside Masuka, learned that detail as a bystander. He had built a frame, and the system had reinforced it without being asked, filling in the gaps with the most convenient available assumption. That is the quiet argument the season ends on. He did not defeat the investigation. The investigation preferred a version of events that required nobody to keep looking. The swamp erased everything, and it did so completely. A fire, a gas explosion, standing water, and a location so remote that response took hours. Whatever forensic story the cabin might have told about who built the room and who used it was gone by the time anyone official arrived. The one place on Earth that could have proved James Dokes innocent burned down with him inside it, and the fire was set by someone who had no interest in either of them. Dokes had spent his last weeks doing the one thing the entire justice system is supposed to do, which is keep asking questions after everyone else has stopped. He died in a cage in a swamp for it, and the official record listed the manner of his death as a choice he made himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Closing a case and being satisfied with it are two different things, and only one of them happened that week. The way Frank Lundy said goodbye to Miami has been picked apart ever since for one reason. He never once mentioned the name of the man he had interviewed about the blood work. Section 8. A case closed on a dead man. The public version of the ending was clean, and it was delivered with confidence. A Miami Metro sergeant had been the Bay Harbor butcher. He had used his position to identify targets, his training to take them apart, and his knowledge of procedure to stay ahead of investigators for years. He had been discovered, he had run, and he had died in a fire in the Everglades after taking one final victim. Case closed. The department did what departments do with a story like that, which is absorb the damage and move forward. Dokes stopped being a colleague and became a cautionary tale. Officers who had worked beside him for a decade had to reconcile the man they had known with the man on the news, and most of them managed it quickly, because the alternative was believing that the evidence was wrong and that the real killer was still in the building. Maria LaGuerta never managed it at all. She had fought the story from the moment it appeared. She had produced an alibi that got thrown out because of a mistake she made herself, and she had watched a federal agent tell her that her attempt to help had destroyed the only chance of clearing him. When the case closed, she was left holding a certainty nobody would share. That certainty sat inside her for years, and eventually cost her everything. Deb's reaction was more complicated. She had worked the task force, she had believed the evidence, and she had also known Dokes personally. She had also just lost the person who had rebuilt her confidence as an investigator, because the moment the case closed, Lundy was leaving. He had told her that would happen. He had said it plainly, early, in the middle of an assignment, and she had been thrown by it. Later he admitted the reason he had brought it up so bluntly was that he had assumed she would get tired of him once the work ended. That admission was the most vulnerable thing the character ever said, and it landed because it came from a man who had spent every other scene being unflappable. When the case closed, he took another one. There was a serial killer operating in Oregon, and the Bureau needed him there. That was the shape of his entire life. Finish a case, board a plane, start again somewhere else, with a small suitcase and a tape recorder and a lunch schedule. Deb planned to meet him at the airport. She did not make it. On the day he flew out, Rita's children, Astor and Cody, had gone missing, and Deb stayed in Miami to help search for them. It is a quiet, cruel piece of writing. The relationship that had done more for Dexter Morgan than anything else in the series ended because she chose to help her brother's family, and her brother's family was in danger because of her brother. The children had been taken by Lila, whose obsession had escalated past anything the season had prepared the audience for. She had burned a cabin with a police officer inside it, and she followed that by setting fire to Dexter's apartment. When the fire failed to accomplish what she wanted, she took the children. Dexter got them back. Lila fled the country, and he tracked her to Paris and killed her there, which closed the only loose thread that could still identify him. That detail deserves stating plainly. The one person alive who knew Dexter Morgan was the Bay Harbor butcher, and who was not a federal agent or a police officer, died at his hands in another country weeks after the case was officially resolved. Every route back to the truth had been sealed. What remains interesting, 17 years after the season aired, is what the FBI actually achieved. The popular summary is that they failed completely, and that summary is too generous to Dexter and too harsh on Lundy. Look at what the task force produced. They identified that the killer targeted guilty men rather than random victims. They identified that some victims had never been convicted of anything, meaning the killer had access to information beyond the public record. They traced the disposal site back to a category of marina using algae chemistry and narrowed a coastline to 3 names. They read a document written specifically to mislead them and pulled a working background out of it, correctly placing the killer inside law enforcement. They correctly concluded that he was inside the investigation. Every one of those findings was accurate. The profile Lundy built described Dexter Morgan with precision. The only thing the task force got wrong was the final name, and they got it wrong because a competing suspect had spent months behaving in a way that made him look guilty, and because that suspect could not be produced to defend himself. They also achieved something more concrete. For most of that season, Dexter did not kill. The pressure of the investigation, combined with Dokes shadowing him, shut down his entire operation. He lost his marina, he lost his disposal method, and had to permanently switch to the Gulf Stream. He lost the ability to keep trophies the way he had for years, since the bloodslide box was now in evidence with his forensic signature on the analysis. The Bay Harbor Butcher, as an operation, was dismantled. Only the man survived. That distinction is what makes the season's ending unsettling rather than triumphant. He won by the smallest possible margin, and he did not win on merit. He was caught. The physical evidence had been found, stolen, and handed to the FBI. The only reason he walked out of that building was that the man who found it was structurally easier to believe as a killer than a mild forensic technician with a girlfriend and a station wagon. Then there is the question that has never been settled, which is what Frank Lundy actually believed at the end. The argument that he knew is built out of specific moments rather than one big reveal. He pulled the Rodrigo file and noticed that the blood analyst who let a murderer walk was the same technician working his task force. He arranged a private conversation about it and pressed until Dexter conceded incompetence. He had already established that the killer had a law enforcement background and was probably inside the investigation. And when the case ended, he accepted the resolution rather than agreeing with it. The argument that he did not know is simpler and probably stronger. He put a protective detail on Dexter. He worked beside him for months without escalating. He slept in the apartment of the man's sister. He left the city without a word to anyone, and when he came back to Miami 2 years later, he walked into a crime scene and greeted Dexter warmly as his favorite blood spatter analyst. The show never resolved it, and that ambiguity is a deliberate piece of construction. It let the audience carry a suspicion that no character in the story could act on. What is certain is that Lundy walked away from Miami with a closed case and an incorrect answer, and that the final sign-off came from a senior administrator who had joined the case in its last week. The man who had done the actual thinking was no longer running the investigation when it concluded. Dexter, for his part, did not treat the ending as a victory to celebrate. He had spent an entire season being afraid, which had never happened before and would only happen a few more times. He had learned that the ocean gives things back, that a colleague's instinct can outperform federal resources, and that his father's system had been imperfect from the start. He had also learned that he could be caught and still walk out, which was a far more dangerous lesson. The damage to Dokes did not stop at his reputation. Every case he had ever worked became suspect. Every conviction he had contributed to became a potential appeal. Defense attorneys across the county now had a decorated sergeant, publicly identified as a serial murderer, sitting in the middle of their clients' case files. That kind of contamination spreads outward for years, and the show never had time to explore it, but it is the realistic consequence of naming a serving officer as the most prolific killer in a city's history. Then there were the 18 families. Men who had been missing for years were identified, and their relatives were told that their sons and brothers had been murdered by a police officer. Some of those men had been suspects in violent crimes themselves, which meant the notifications arrived tangled up with old grief and old accusations. The case produced closure for dozens of people, and all of that closure was built on a false name. Every one of those people had spent years waiting for information, and the information they finally received was accurate in every detail except the one that mattered most. For Deb, the ending was a compound loss she did not have the language for. She had lost Dokes, who she had known and respected. She had lost her belief that she could read people, which had already been shredded once. And she had lost Lundy, who had been the first person since her father to make her feel like a real investigator rather than a survivor. She went back to work in a department that had just been publicly humiliated, with a brother she had no reason to look at twice. What the season left behind for Dexter was a permanent operational change. The Gulf Stream became his disposal method from that point forward, which meant longer trips, more fuel, more time on the water, and more exposure to being seen. He never again used a single fixed site. He never again kept a trophy collection in a place anyone could reach without a warrant. And when he eventually started a second box of slides, he understood exactly what it could cost him. The argument about whether Lundy knew has never gone away, and the reason it persists is that both readings are supported by the same scenes. A viewer who believes he knew sees a profiler quietly gathering data on a suspect he cannot prosecute, standing down when the Bureau hands the case to someone else, and choosing to leave rather than watch an unwinnable fight. A viewer who believes he did not sees an excellent investigator defeated by the same thing that defeats real investigators, which is a suspect who looks better on paper than the correct answer. The show gave one small piece of evidence to each side in Season 4. Lundy returned to Miami and sought Dexter out immediately, treated him as a colleague, asked for his help, and spent weeks working alongside him without a hint of suspicion. That behavior fits a man who never suspected him. It also fits a man who had spent his career learning to keep people close when nothing can be proven. What is not ambiguous is the shape of the failure. The Bureau got the profile right and the person wrong, and the gap between those two things was filled by a colleague who made himself the more believable candidate. Investigations do not fail because investigators are stupid. They fail because a story arrives that explains everything, and explanations that fit are almost impossible to argue with once they have been announced to the public. Dexter came out of it with his freedom, his job, his family, and a permanent understanding that he had survived on luck rather than skill. That understanding did not make him more careful. It made him more confident, and that confidence is what set up almost every disaster that followed. The season also ended with a piece of misdirection that the show never drew attention to. The public believed the Bay Harbor butcher had been stopped, which meant the pressure that had shut down Dexter's operation lifted entirely. Nobody was watching the water anymore. Nobody was reviewing marina footage. The single most effective investigation ever conducted against him ended by giving him the safest working conditions he had enjoyed in years. The most reliable protection Dexter ever had was not his method or his caution. It was the fact that the version of events pointing at him would have required a lot of people to admit they had been badly wrong in public, and the version pointing away from him required nobody to admit anything at all. Dokes was the last person in Miami who had been watching him closely, and Dokes was gone. Lundy was in Oregon. LaGuardia had been told to drop it. For the first time since his father died, there was nobody in that department with any reason to look twice at the man in the forensics lab. There is one more consequence the season never had time to show. A case of that size produces a paper trail that outlives everyone attached to it. Reports, transcripts, evidence logs, and press statements, all recording a version of events that was wrong from the first page. Anyone reopening it years later would begin by reading the work of the man who had committed the murders, presented in his own handwriting, signed and dated, and filed correctly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, a car pulled up outside a Miami crime scene, and an older man in a plain suit walked in and asked for the blood spatter analyst by name. He was not carrying a badge anymore. He was carrying a map, a stack of photographs, and 30 years of murders that nobody else in the country believed existed. Section 9, The Retired Agent and the Man Who Got Away, Season 4, opened on September 27, 2009, with a homicide that looked wrong to everyone who saw it. A young woman named Lisa Bell had been killed in her bathtub. Her femoral artery had been cut and she had bled out within minutes. The scene was immaculate. Whoever had done it had taken his time, worked carefully, and cleaned up thoroughly afterward, which is not how most murders in Miami looked. Dexter went back to the house with a forensic technician and found something underneath a tile that had no business being there. Older blood. Not from this killing. Blood from something that had happened in that same room a long time earlier. Then a familiar voice came from the doorway. Frank Lundy walked in and greeted him warmly, calling him his favorite blood spatter analyst. Dexter, in narration, responded to himself with a single word of dread. Lundy was in Miami because a database had flagged a girl recently killed at that address. He asked Dexter to confirm whether the femoral artery had been severed and whether the scene had been meticulously cleaned. Dexter confirmed both. Lundy asked to meet him at the station. At Miami Metro, Masuka was starstruck all over again. Lundy asked to speak with Dexter alone, and then he explained why he was there. He had retired from the bureau. He no longer had federal resources, a badge, or a task force. He was spending his retirement chasing one specific man, the one who had gotten away from him, and he had given that man a name. He called him the Trinity Killer, because he killed in threes, in cycles, in cities all across the country. Lundy had built the pattern out of scattered cases nobody else had connected, and he had one enormous problem, which was that he could not prove the man existed. There was no agency behind him, no case number, no official investigation. There was a retired agent with a map, a pile of photographs, and a theory. Lisa Bell's murder fit the profile. Lundy was certain Trinity had come to Miami and had begun a new cycle. When Lundy said Trinity had been killing for around 15 years, Dexter told him about the older blood in that bathtub, which matched the murder of a woman named Vicky Noonan roughly 30 years earlier. The two of them worked it out together, standing in a hallway. Trinity had not been active for 15 years. He had been active for at least 30. Dexter's assessment, delivered with something close to admiration, was that this was the most successful serial killer ever to get away with it. That conversation is one of the strangest things the series ever staged. A serial killer and the retired FBI agent who had once hunted him, standing together, jointly discovering that a third serial killer had been operating undetected for 3 decades. Two hunters comparing notes, one of them permanently invisible to the other. Lundy was building a private task force, quietly, without official sanction. He told Deb it was confidential when she pointed out that he had disappeared for 2 years without a word. She was with Anton Briggs by then, and made it clear that whatever had happened between them belonged to the past. She went to his hotel room specifically to tell him not to get his hopes up, and he responded by showing her the map on his wall, the photographs, the files, and explaining that he had come to Miami for Trinity rather than for her. She left feeling like an idiot, which is exactly the note the show wanted. The Trinity investigation gave Lundy his best material as a character because it stripped away the institution and left the obsession. He turned up at a scene where a woman named Tarla Grant had fallen from an abandoned warehouse. It looked like a suicide, and the department was ready to treat it as one. Lundy walked the site, dictating notes into his recorder, and predicted the details before anyone confirmed them. If she was Trinity's, she would be a woman with a husband and 2 children, and there would have been a similar death at that same location 30 years earlier. He was right on both counts. His reading of Trinity as a person was equally sharp, and it doubled as a description of himself. He believed Trinity had survived so long because he was a lone wolf who drifted through life having given up all but the most basic human connections. Then he pointed out that the same description fit him, since the hunt had been the only thing that excited him for most of his career. He told Dexter that people like them do not really belong anywhere. Dexter listened to a retired FBI profiler describe the psychology of an undetected serial killer, apply it to himself, and include Dexter in the category without knowing why that was accurate. LaGuerta had no patience for any of it. Lundy had no standing in Miami anymore, and when she found him in the lab going through evidence with Deb, she effectively threw him out. On his way past Dexter, he made a remark about the feeling of being close to catching somebody, and how good that feeling is. Dexter knew that feeling well. Then Trinity noticed him. In a library, Arthur Mitchell sat at a public computer, looking at photographs and blueprints of an office building, planning a killing that would repeat something he had done 30 years earlier. He glanced over and saw a newspaper headline announcing that Frank Lundy had returned to Miami to hunt a serial killer. The most dangerous man in the country now knew that the one person tracking him was in the same city and had his name and face printed in the paper. What happened next is the sequence that makes the Lundy story tragic. He worked out where Trinity's next kill would likely occur, narrowing it to 2 possibilities based on the 30-year-old pattern. He staked out one of them, an office building at 100 Ocean Gate, that had replaced the site of an earlier murder, and stood outside dictating observations into his recorder. Arthur Mitchell walked out of the lobby, saw him, and understood immediately that he had been found. He said so out loud. Then he walked directly at Lundy, deliberately shouldered into him, and dropped his keys in the process. He apologized and kept walking, leaving the keys on the ground. Lundy picked them up and followed him to return them, which is exactly what a decent person does. Trinity reached the street and boarded a bus. Lundy stood there and recorded a description of the man he had just been close enough to touch. Gray hair, blue eyes, something in them. He had made contact with the killer he had spent his retirement chasing, and he did not know it. That same night, Deb came to his hotel. Whatever she had told herself about Anton and about the past collapsed at the door. They resumed the relationship, and the show let them have one evening of it. The next morning, as Deb was leaving the hotel, a gunshot cracked across the parking area. She looked down and saw that she had been hit. 2 more shots followed, and Lundy went down beside her. From her position on the ground, she watched a hand reach into his pocket and pull out his wallet. She told him to stay with her as she lost consciousness. Frank Lundy was shot twice and died there. Deb took 1 round above the hip and survived. The episode was called Dex Takes a Holiday, and it aired on October 18, 2009. Dexter's reaction was the closest thing to genuine respect he ever showed a member of law enforcement. He acknowledged that Lundy had been a worthy opponent, and that a man like that did not deserve to die that way, shot in a parking lot and robbed of his wallet like a random victim. The man who had come closer than anyone alive to catching the Bay Harbor butcher, and who had come closer in a few weeks to Trinity than 30 years of American law enforcement, was killed in a hotel car park in a scene staged to look like a mugging. Retirement had changed Lundy in ways that made him both better and worse at his job. Better, because he no longer answered to anyone. He could chase a theory the Bureau had never accepted in a city where he had no authority, without filing a report or justifying an expense. Worse, because he had none of the infrastructure that had made him formidable in Miami 2 years earlier. No task force, no laboratory, no warrants, no subpoena power, and nobody to notice if he went missing. The Trinity case was also personal, in a way the Bay Harbor butcher case never had been. The butcher was work. Trinity was the one who had gotten away, and Lundy had spent the last stretch of his career and the whole of his retirement trying to prove that a pattern existed at all. When he told Dexter he could not prove the man was real, he was describing the loneliest position an investigator can occupy, which is being certain about something no institution will accept. His method held up even without resources. He built the cycle from scattered cases across 8 cities. He worked out the structure of the killings well enough to predict the victim profile before identification came back. He recognized that Trinity had returned to a city he had used before, which was a break in a 30-year pattern, and therefore the most important fact available. All of that came out of records, maps, and thinking, done by one man in a hotel room. The parallels between Lundy and the men he hunted got more explicit the longer the season ran. He described Trinity as someone who had survived by giving up nearly every human connection, then acknowledged that the same description applied to him, and included Dexter in the same category without knowing it. 3 men in that conversation, and 2 of them were killers. Lundy was the only one who was aware of how isolated he had become, and it did not stop him. The near miss outside the office building is one of the most painful sequences in the series, precisely because nothing dramatic happens in it. There is no chase and no confrontation. A man walks out of a lobby, recognizes the person who has been hunting him, walks straight into him, drops his keys, apologizes, and gets on a bus. Lundy picks up the keys and tries to return them, because that is what a decent person does. He then records the most accurate description of the Trinity killer that had ever existed and files it away as an unremarkable encounter. Arthur Mitchell had spotted the newspaper story about Lundy's arrival, which means the collision was not a coincidence. He had gone looking for the man hunting him, put a face to the threat, and then decided what to do about it. Everything that followed at that hotel was the result of that decision. Dexter's response to Lundy's death is one of the few moments in the series where his narration reads as genuine rather than performed. He had feared this man, had spent an entire season certain that Lundy was the one person capable of ending him, and had come to view him as a legitimate adversary. Watching him die in a parking lot, robbed of his wallet, treated by the department as a random victim of an unrelated crime spree, offended something in Dexter that ordinary murder did not. For Deb, it was catastrophic in a way that shaped the rest of the series. She survived a gunshot wound, watched the person she loved die inches away from her, and then had to be removed from the investigation because of her own status as a victim. She spent the following episodes running an investigation through other people, blaming herself, and pushing away everyone who tried to help. One small detail in his return lands harder on every rewatch. When Lundy walked into that crime scene and greeted Dexter, he did it with real warmth, the way a person greets a former colleague they liked working with. Whatever else the Bay Harbor butcher case had been, it had also been months of the two of them working side by side, and Lundy remembered it fondly. He came back to Miami and sought out the one man in the city, guaranteed to want him gone. He had come back to Miami with no badge, no team, and no authority, and within a matter of weeks, he had gotten within arm's length of a man who had killed across the country for 3 decades. Nobody with a badge had ever come that close, before or after. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wallet was the tell, because nobody takes a wallet by accident. Somebody wanted that shooting to look like a robbery, and the person who pulled the trigger had been standing inside Miami Metro's investigation the entire time, sleeping beside one of its detectives and asking questions nobody thought to examine. Section 10. What the Bureau never caught. The first theory was that the shooting had been the work of the vacation murderers, a pair who had been killing tourists across Miami. It fit loosely enough for a department under pressure to accept it, and it sent the investigation in the wrong direction for weeks. Deb, recovering from a gunshot wound and from watching Lundy die in front of her, was removed from the case on the grounds that she was now officially a victim, which meant she had to run her own investigation secondhand through Joey Quinn. Progress came through detail work. Masuka and Deb established from the ballistics and the geometry of the shooting that the person who fired had been too short to be Trinity himself. That finding put Deb back on the case and eliminated the one suspect everyone had assumed. The answer had been standing in the room the entire time. Christine Hill was a reporter who had first appeared at a crime scene in the season premiere looking for a story and had struck up a relationship with Quinn. Through him, she had steady access to the department's thinking on the Trinity case, and she used it. Everyone around her read her as an ambitious journalist working a source. She gave herself away with a single sentence. Talking to Deb, she expressed sympathy about how awful it must have been to watch Lundy die right in front of her eyes. Deb accepted the sympathy at the time, and then went back over it later. That specific detail, that Lundy had died directly in front of her, had never been made public. There was no way a reporter could know it. The Thanksgiving episode, Hungry Man, closed on Christine welcoming an unexpected visitor to her apartment after Quinn left. It was Arthur Mitchell. She called him Dad. The following episode, Lost Boys, confirmed it. Christine Hill had shot Frank Lundy and had shot Deborah Morgan. She had done it because her father was in danger of being caught, and she had taken the wallet afterward to dress the scene as a robbery. She was a young woman who had spent her life trying to earn the approval of a man who barely acknowledged her, and killing a federal agent was her attempt at it. Arthur gave her nothing. When she was eventually cornered, he refused to help her. She went to Deb intending to confess everything about her father and was told that the department had already identified Trinity as someone else entirely, which meant she believed her father had covered his own tracks and left her with nothing. She talked about becoming a killer to please him, and then she took her own life in front of Deb. The last piece of Lundy's work outlived all of it, and it went to the one person who should never have had it. Lundy had recorded a description of the man who bumped into him outside that office building. Gray hair, blue eyes, height, build. The whole observation dictated into his tape recorder minutes after the encounter. That recording made its way into evidence, and Dexter listened to it. The retired FBI agent's final piece of investigative work, a description of the Trinity killer, taken from a face-to-face meeting, became the thing that let Dexter identify Arthur Mitchell. Frank Lundy did solve his last case. The solution simply passed through him, into the hands of a serial killer, and ended in a kill room rather than a courtroom. His photograph and his FBI identification turned up on screen again during the investigation into his own death, in an episode called Roadkill, which is the last time the series showed him as anything other than memory. The Bay Harbor Butcher case did not stay closed forever, though it never reopened either. Years later, in Season 7, Maria LaGuerta found a bloodslide at the scene where Travis Marshall had apparently taken his own life. She recognized it immediately for what it was, because she had been in the building when 46 of them were cataloged. That single object told her that the case she had never accepted had been wrong all along, and it gave her a reason to start pulling on it again. She did what nobody else had been willing to do. She went back through the Bay Harbor Butcher file, looking for the man everyone had stopped looking for, driven by loyalty to a dead sergeant whose name she had spent years trying to clear. She got closer than the FBI ever had, working alone, with no task force and no support, and with everyone above her treating the file as ancient history. Nobody believed her. She brought her suspicions forward and was treated as a woman who had never let go of an old grievance, and in the end, protecting her brother, Dexter Morgan shot and killed Maria LaGuerta. Deb carried that for the rest of her life, and it damaged her more than anything the ice truck killer had done to her. 2 people were now dead for the crime of being right about James Dokes. The case surfaced one final time far from Miami. Years after LaGuerta's death, in Iron Lake, New York, a police chief named Angela Bishop became suspicious of a quiet local man living under the name Jim Lindsay. Her suspicion started as instinct, exactly the way Dokes's had, and it built from there through a series of small inconsistencies that nobody else in town noticed. Bishop eventually reached out to Captain Angel Batista in Miami, told him that Dexter Morgan was alive, and shared her belief that he was the Bay Harbor Butcher. Batista identified him from a photograph. For the first time since the field morgue flooded, the case had a living suspect, a working investigator, and an official channel back to the department that had closed it. It came apart, the way it always came apart. Dexter escaped custody, a police officer died, and the story ended in the snow, with his son holding the rifle. Frank Lundy himself made one last appearance in that series, in a flashback in the finale, a reminder of the one investigator who had gotten closest while the man was still working. Later still, in Dexter Resurrection, the Bay Harbor Butcher case came close to reopening once more, dragged back toward the light by people who had never stopped being uneasy about how neatly it had ended. Across every version of the story, the pattern held. The people who came closest to Dexter Morgan were never the ones with the largest resources. A sergeant with a hunch and a screwdriver found 46 slides in an afternoon. A captain with stubborn loyalty found a single slide at an unrelated scene and reconstructed the whole thing. A small-town police chief with a local department and a bad feeling got further in a few weeks than a federal task force managed in a season. The FBI, with a national manhunt, a marine biologist, a verified manifesto, round-the-clock marina surveillance, and the best profiler in the country, built a portrait so accurate it described Dexter Morgan down to his job title, and then wrote the wrong name underneath it. And the man who built that portrait died in a parking lot with his shoes on, holding a description of another killer, still working a case that no agency had ever authorized. The details of how Christine Hill was uncovered say something about what actually breaks cases open, and it has nothing to do with resources. 2 facts did it: a ballistics and geometry finding about the shooter's height, produced by Masuka doing careful ordinary lab work, and a single sentence of misplaced sympathy that contained information the speaker should not have had. Neither of those required a federal task force. They required people paying attention. The relationship between Christine and her father is also the season's clearest statement about what these men do to the people around them. She had grown up wanting Arthur Mitchell's attention and had received almost none of it. Killing a federal agent to protect him was an offering, and he treated it as an inconvenience. When she was finally cornered and needed him, he did nothing. She died believing he had abandoned her, which he had. The way Lundy's final work reached Dexter is the cruelest structural joke in the series. Everything Lundy had built over 30 years, and everything he had gathered in Miami, ended up compressed into a few seconds of audio describing a gray-haired man with blue eyes. That recording went into evidence, and Dexter listened to it. A retired FBI agent's last observation became the identification that led a serial killer to another serial killer's front door. It also means the Trinity case was closed by the wrong person for the wrong reasons, using the right information. Lundy wanted an arrest, a trial, and a public record proving that the pattern he had spent decades tracking was real. What he got instead was a private killing in a room lined with plastic and a case file that never officially existed. LaGuerta's return to the Bay Harbor Butcher file years later is the most direct challenge the series ever mounted to its own ending, and the detail of how close she got matters. She started from one physical object, a single blood slide found at a scene where it had no reason to be. From there, she reasoned backward, correctly, to the conclusion that the case had been closed on the wrong man, and then forward toward the person who had actually done it. She was working against a department that considered the matter finished, a captain's reputation on the line, and the absence of every original piece of evidence. She was also motivated by something the Bureau never had, which was loyalty to a specific dead man. Lundy hunted a category. LaGuerta was trying to give a name back to a friend. That difference in motive is why she kept going when everyone told her to stop, and it is why she got further than any federal investigator. The pattern repeated one last time in Iron Lake, thousands of miles from Miami, in a town small enough to have a police department that would fit inside a Miami Metro conference room. Angela Bishop had no task force, no profiler, and no forensic laboratory. What she had was proximity and instinct, which turned out to be the two things that had always worked. Her call to Angel Batista was the closest the Bay Harbor Butcher case ever came to being reopened. For a brief window, a serving captain in Miami knew that Dexter Morgan was alive. A police chief in New York had him in a cell, and the file that had been closed on James Dokes was about to be examined by people with no reason to protect the original conclusion. It ended the way these things always ended around Dexter, which is with someone else dead and the paperwork pointing somewhere convenient. What the whole arc adds up to is a fairly bleak observation about how institutions handle a case like this. The federal government brought its best people and its best methods and produced an accurate portrait that it then attached to the wrong man, because the wrong man had made himself easy to believe and the right man had made himself impossible to see. The people who saw him clearly were the ones close enough to feel that something was off, and none of them had the standing to be listened to. Dokes was called unstable. LaGuerta was called obsessed. Bishop was told she was chasing a feeling. All three of them were correct, and all three of them paid for it. The Bay Harbor Butcher file is still technically closed, under the name of a man who never killed anyone outside of a uniform. 18 bodies from the water, 28 names from a box of slides, and one sergeant who spent his final days in a cage trying to convince someone that the analyst in the lab had done all of it. The record does not reflect any of that, and the only people who ever came close to correcting it are no longer in a position to. None of it was ever corrected. The evidence stayed filed, the name stayed attached, and the man who put those bodies in the water kept coming to work, kept analyzing blood for the department, and kept his boat in the water for another 6 seasons. And somewhere in a storage room in Miami sits a wooden box that once held 46 glass slides, logged into evidence under a sergeant's name, analyzed and cataloged by the man who filled it. What lingers about the whole arc is how quiet the failure was. There was no cover-up, no corruption, and no single person who did anything obviously wrong. Competent people did competent work, arrived at a conclusion the evidence supported, and closed a file. The system functioned exactly as designed, and the result was a dead sergeant with a monster's name attached to him, and a forensic technician driving home at the end of his shift. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.